Hi there and welcome to this video. I'm sure all of us as photographers and videographers really want our subjects to look good, especially when we're talking about subjects that are people. They say that your first YouTube video is the most difficult to get in the can because you have to break the idea of looking at yourself when you're editing your videos quite often. Well, I can assure you it doesn't get any easier after the first video. So any help that I can get to achieve what pros used a team of makeup artists to achieve is appreciated by myself. So today we're going to look at some functionality that was released in the Z8. As of today it's only in the Z8, but we may well see it appear in the Z9 in the future in some firmware updates, I'm sure. The functionality is skin softening, and it's part of a package of functionality that came in the Z8 about enhancing human subjects, and it comes with enhanced white balance for human subjects and portrait impression balance. Now, manuals are great to help us set up our camera, but often we need to play with functionality to work out how it works in different contexts and situations. The challenge here though is the time it takes when you've got oodles of formats and codecs. With skin softening, we're talking about photo and video. There are 4 different settings and we have to understand how it interacts with picture controls and other functionality. So in this video I'm going to try and cut through and give some insights into how skin softening works. In the photo area, I'm going to look at RAW and JPEG Fine, and we're going to dip into JPEG Fine Star. I've looked at how it interacts with neutral picture control and portrait picture control. I've looked at how it works with SDR and HLG tone modes, and I've looked at it in an indoor and an outdoor setting. With regards to video, I've looked at 4K H.265 10-bit video, and I've used SDR and HLG tone modes, and again looked at neutral and portrait picture controls, both indoors and outdoors. Overall, that gives a really good spread of different situations. It won't cover every situation, but it should give you an insight into the role and the effect of skin softening. So a slight spoiler alert, the clue is in the title, skin softening. This is a very subtle adjustment in camera, and therefore don't expect massive radical changes. That then brings me on to a slight health warning. When I've been reviewing my images and my footage, I've been doing it with the images and footage straight out of the camera and reviewing it on a calibrated 4K monitor. How that then converts to what you see through YouTube and on your devices is subject to YouTube compression and things that I have no control over. So I hope this gives you an insight with both my narration, my voiceover, and the images you can see. But let's get started and look at the approach I took. So as with other videos, I've taken a real-world rather than a laboratory approach to this testing. I shot 2 sets of images and 2 sets of footage. One of each was indoors and one was outdoors, and I shot each of the sets of images and footage as close together as possible to avoid too much variation in conditions. That said, there are some slight minor lighting changes. You know, I do live in the UK and the lighting is a little variable even in the summer, but they're within tolerance. Now I shot in manual mode, and normally I shoot my videos at about an aperture of f3.5 to make sure that my face is in focus but the background is out of focus. In this instance I moved to an aperture of f8 to make sure I removed any blurring or softening from that depth of field. I did make some slight tweaks to balance the exposures in the images in particular, but that was really less than a stop just to balance them so they were direct comparisons, and there was no other post-processing done in the still images. In the video I made minor adjustments predominantly in the HLG format, as that's very flat, to give us a comparison between SDR and HLG. So really limited post-processing. I did review the original images and footage straight out of the camera pretty much on a calibrated 4K monitor, and what you'll see is I've created a series of comparisons to try and highlight the really subtle effect that skin softening has. So let's get into those comparisons and reviews. So let's start with the still images that I captured, and you'll see I've imported them all here into Lightroom Classic. I've coloured them red for the raw ones, yellow for the Jpeg fine neutral picture control, green for the portrait picture control, purple for the high log gamma, and then the blue ones are the fine star ones. You've got the outdoor ones first and then the indoor ones. The lighting on the indoor ones is a lot harsher. It was a single light. I did it on purpose just to create a slightly harsher image to see the effect. Let's start with the raw images. What I noticed was in Lightroom and in Photoshop, there was no discernible difference between any of the settings in RAW. Now, this is perhaps not surprising because being third-party applications, Lightroom and Photoshop don't pull through all of the settings in the RAW file from the Nikon cameras. So what you have to do is use Nikon's proprietary NX Studio if you want to see the effect in the raw images. So what we have here on the left hand side is a lossless raw image with neutral picture control set and the skin softening turned off, and you'll see over in the right hand column we've got the picture control at the top, and then if you scroll down to portrait enhancements we have skin softening. Interestingly, if you have it turned off in the camera, you can't turn it on in NX Studio, whereas the image on the right is one that was recorded raw, neutral picture control, but with skin softening set to high. You can adjust it in NX Studio. So this is the two ends of the continuum in the neutral profile. You can see there is a difference in the raw file that you couldn't see in the Adobe packages. Largely it's brought the contrast down. It's made it a much smoother image. Remember, this is the two ends of the continuum. One end is with skin softening turned off and one is with it set to high, the right hand one. Now what you can do is, obviously in Studio you can change the setting from the one shot from high. I can turn it off and you should see the difference. It's quite subtle. If I turn it back to high, you can probably see that it's softening around the cheeks, largely below the eyes on this image, a little bit of the neck, the cheeks predominantly, and the area underneath the eyes, and it brings the contrast down largely. It doesn't seem to affect the colour too much, it just brings the contrast down to smooth the skin. So I'll do it again. So that's off and that's on, and you can just see after a second it changes. Now if I go back to off, there we go, you could just see it particularly around the corners of the eyes where the contrast changed. If I go up to low, it's a very subtle difference. Again, if I go up to standard, you can barely see the change, and then if I go up to high, again you can barely see the changes between off and low, low and standard, standard and high. It's only when you jump from having it turned off to having it to high that you can see the difference, or perhaps going to normal. If I now switch the image on the left from being one with skin softening turned off to one with portrait picture control, you'll see the difference between the image on the right is the one with neutral picture control and the one on the left is with portrait picture control, and they've both got skin softening set to high. And what you can see is there's a little bit more sharpening that the picture control does on the image on the left in the portrait mode, and it also brings up the saturation and the vibrancy in the skin, so it makes it slightly more red. And this is quite important to really think through if you're going to be using this, working out which are the right settings for the type of skin of your subject that you're shooting or you're likely to be shooting. So again, I'll change the image on the left for one with the high log gamma. Now this is quite a harsh profile when you look at it in here, and will require a lot more editing in post-production. But what it does, again, if you have skin softening turned off in the camera, you can't turn it on in post-production in NX Studio. But this one I've chosen has got it set to high, and if I turn it off, you can really see the difference much more in this high log gamma profile. So I'll turn it back on to high, and you can see it's very visible, the softening that happens. You know, as I said, when with skin softening turned off, it is quite a harsh profile because it has got a, you know, it is that high log gamma profile. And therefore, you know, it is a good way of us seeing what the skin softening is actually doing. In here it's working, you can see it's bringing down the contrast in those very high contrasty areas. I'm only showing you this because it's a better way of showing the effect that's actually happening in RAW. So if you're going to be shooting in RAW, you've got to be using NX Studio if you want to really use skin softening. There's no harm in having it turned on in the camera. Even if you're using the Adobe suite, it doesn't change anything in there. In fact, if you then wanted to use it, you could flip into NX Studio, and as I say, if it's already on in the camera, you can adjust it in NX Studio. If it's turned off in the camera, you can't do anything about it in post-production. So I hope that's given you an insight into the RAW files, and we'll now jump back into Adobe to look at the JPEG files. So we're back in Adobe Lightroom Classic here, and it's just worth mentioning that with JPEG files, if you use NX Studio, unlike the RAW files where you can change the picture control and the skin softening in post-production, you can't do that with JPEGs. What you take in the camera is locked in. For obvious reasons. So just looking at these images, the JPEGs in Adobe Lightroom Classic, let's start with the ones that I shot in fine quality with the neutral profile, the yellow marked ones. So let's just open up the outdoor ones. Now here, as with the RAW, actually looking across one by one from left, which is off, through low, normal and high, actually from one to the next it's very, very subtle. It's only when you jump from one end to the other, or perhaps off to normal, that you really see the difference. So let's just do that. Let's look at off and high and see if we can just see, look at full size, you can see the difference. Particularly again around the cheeks, just under the eyes, around this area to the left of my head as it's looking at you, and perhaps a little bit around the neck where it's just reduced the contrast and just softened the image. If we jump into 50% and just look at the detail, you can start to see that it is slightly softer under the eyes. It is quite subtle though. When you're pixel peeping, you can see it, but it's actually more noticeable perhaps when you're out at full size images. Let's just have a look at the indoor images, which, as I say, were shot with a slightly harsher light, just a single light in front of me. Again, if we zoom into 50%, you can really see the difference here on the forehead, around the side of the head and on the cheeks. So in this harsh lighting condition, it's made a bigger impact. It really has softened the skin quite a lot to make the image far more, perhaps far better for certain situations. Again, if we look at the overall image, you can see that all of the skin tones, including the neck and the face, have softened and become slightly flatter, but it's quite a good effect, I think, for one quick change in camera. So let's look at portrait now, and if we go to portrait, which are the green ones, and we look at the outdoor ones, again you can see a similar effect. As I said, in the RAW, the portrait picture control brings up the saturation in the skin tones slightly, makes them slightly pinker. That may be right for the tone of skin that you're shooting. It may not work. So really thinking about how we use picture controls in collaboration with skin softening is really important. A little bit of planning can be quite effective. Zooming into 50%, again we can start to see the subtlety, the high smoothing on the right, particularly around the eyes, and some of the lines are starting to perhaps disappear a little bit on the forehead and around the eyes. So it just softens the image. Let's look at the indoor ones just very quickly. Again, you can see the softening is quite marked here with the much harsher lighting conditions. So, you know, when you zoom in, you can really start to see the effect on the whole of the face, and particularly around the sides and the cheeks is where you really start to see it. If we now jump to the HLG, the high log gamma, which we saw in the RAW, was where we saw the biggest change. All I've done here is just bring down the exposure by about 1 stop just to make it a bit more comparable with the other images. But you can see on the right, you know, there's a lot of contrast in the image when the skin softening is turned off. And when it's turned on, actually it makes that image much softer, much nicer for a human subject. So really worth thinking about if you're shooting in HLG. It's important to remember that the size of the images for a fine Jpeg is about 12 megabytes. For an HLG image, it's about 4 megabytes. So there's a big saving here in terms of size. So let's look at the effect of the high log gamma versus the neutral fine image. The neutral fine is 12 megabytes. The high log gamma is 4 megabytes, as I said. In terms of detail, they're very similar. The high log gamma, because I haven't done any processing on it, is a little bit flatter than the neutral picture control fine one. But if you're looking for really small files, then skin softening could be a really good setting to have turned on if you're shooting people, because it will take a lot of it will perhaps take some of the burden out of post-production that you're going to have to do with high log gamma. If we now compare the neutral fine with the neutral fine star, the neutral fine in terms of size is about 12 megabytes. The neutral fine star is about 16 megabytes. As you can see, there's very little difference in the image quality. You perhaps see a little bit more sharpness in the hair and in the details in the fine star, but you've got to be pixel peeping to really see that, and the skin softening works equally well in either of those images. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into skin softening in both RAW and JPEG. Let's just go back. That's using skin softening. If you're shooting RAW in particular, but JPEG also, I've done it with RAW just to show you. In Lightroom Classic, there are some adaptive presets that you can use. I've done 3 of them here that detect the human subject and then apply different settings to them. So the one with 1 star here is the polished portrait. The one with 2 stars next to it is the enhanced portrait, and the one with 3 stars is the glamour portrait. So let's just take a look at the original RAW file, which is the one on the far left, with the polished portrait next to its right, the enhanced portrait, and then the glamour portrait. You can see that compared to the original RAW file, each of the presets in Adobe Lightroom have softened and have just given a different effect to that and just softened the portrait down a little bit. If we come back out and we look at the original and the polished portrait, now I've just set this at 100. You can make the effect even greater or lesser in Lightroom, but this is just set at 100. You can see that it's softened the face. It's perhaps brought up the contrast and the exposure in the eyes. So what you get in Lightroom in the presets, these adaptive presets, is a far more holistic adjustment to the whole portrait, not just the skin tones. Let's look at the enhanced one and compare the original with the enhanced one. Again, you can see it's softened the image. It's created quite a nice portrait from that. If we then finally compare the original with the glamour one, you can really see this has gone to town. This is probably not one that I would necessarily use on myself. It's almost given me a lipstick look. You can see it's really intended, as the title says, a glamour for perhaps something far more glamorous than myself, of course. So each of the presets in Lightroom could be useful for different kinds of images. So we're starting to get quite a few different ways of quickly adjusting portraits, either in camera or in post-production. So my thinking around this, having gone through all of these different images and really spent some time looking at them, is that if I'm shooting in JPEG and SDR, I'll definitely have skin softening turned on in camera. With my complexion, my skin type, I'd probably use SDR, tone profile, and either neutral, possibly portrait, and then normal in skin softening to give a balanced approach. If I was using the HLG, the high log gamma profile, then I would definitely have skin softening turned on, and that really brings down the amount of post-production required. If I'm shooting in RAW, then I'll probably still have it turned on, even though I tend to use Lightroom and Photoshop as my the packages of choice when I'm doing post-production. If I really wanted to use the Nikon in-camera skin softening, then that would leave me free to jump back into NX Studio, adjust it, and then carry on. So it leaves all doors open. So it's great that Nikon is building all this functionality into our cameras. As the Nikon Z series has developed, we've seen the menus get longer and more complex. There's an almost infinite number of permutations of settings we can choose, and therefore it probably means we have to really think a bit more about what's our preferred settings, and that's where the menu banks become quite useful, in that I've got menu bank C on my camera set up as portrait, so I can have things like skin softening turned on in that, but turned off in action perhaps, where I'm not going to necessarily need it. So really thinking about these kind of settings and looking at how and when we want to use them is really important, and a little bit of planning can really enhance the capabilities that we can deploy from our cameras and the outputs we get from them. So that's still images. Let's now take a look at video. So you may remember from the introduction that with videos I've focused on 4K H.265 10-bit codec, and I've recorded videos indoors and outdoors in SDR, neutral picture control and portrait picture control, and I've also recorded a video in HLG high log gamma tone mode as well. So let's get into those and start looking at those different types of videos. So these are the SDR neutral picture control videos, ranging from skin softening off on the left through to high on the right. As with the still images, the difference between off and low, low and normal, normal and high is quite small, but when you do put the off and high next to each other, you can definitely see the impact of skin softening. What's really impressive is that and probably shows the power of the XP7 processor, is that the camera can do this live in camera. I've shot with 4K here to make the rendering a little bit easier, but you can do it with 8K footage as well at H.265, so pretty impressive. So this is the SDR neutral on the indoor footage. As you can see, similar to the outdoor, as the name would suggest, it gives quite a flat neutral profile. The skin softening does have an impact here, and it gives latitude to do a little bit of post-processing. I have done minimal post-processing of these images just to show the skin softening. And this is the SDR with portrait picture control on. As with the still images, it brings out the slight pinkiness in the skin, but you can see the skin softening, particularly when you look from the off on the left hand side to the high on the right hand side, particularly around the cheeks and under the eyes. Very subtle but quite effective. And the same portrait picture control with the indoor, slightly more harsh lighting. Again, you can see it's done a reasonably good job in just bringing the contrast down in the skin tones in this video. So the HLG video gives a much flatter video as a starting point for editing. And in these outdoor videos, I've just brought the exposure up a little, nothing more than that, no major editing done on them. But what you can see is, as with the still images, you get in the HLG footage, we're seeing probably the biggest impact of skin softening from the off to the high. And here's the indoor footage with, again, a slight exposure tweak. I'm hoping that the YouTube compression algorithms haven't compressed it so much that you can't see the difference between the off and the high videos. Because in the HLG, it's like the still images, there is quite a noticeable difference. Maybe not between the individual levels from off to low, low to normal, normal to high, but from off to high, you can definitely see it in the raw images. And finally, here's a comparison of the SDR neutral with skin softening off, with SDR neutral with high skin softening, SDR portrait with high skin softening, and HLG high skin softening. Just to give you a comparison of the high settings across the different tone modes that I recorded in. And what I hope this shows is that there is a difference between off and high, but equally it's important for us to think about how we overlaying skin softening on the picture controls and some of the other settings in video. It's as important as we discussed in the still images, and will be context and subject dependent. So I hope you found the various still image comparisons and the video comparisons useful. It is new functionality, and therefore it's really important to understand what it can do, what's the art of the possible, and how can we build it in to get better outcomes and outputs from our digital mirrorless cameras. In most cases, shooting portraits and people is about subtlety and smoothness to make the subject look great. Skin softening isn't about obvious changes. It's about small adjustments in camera to save you time in post-production whilst achieving that great look. That's what Nikon says was their aim when you put it together with the enhanced white balance for human subjects and the portrait impression balance capability. Often when we can't easily see the impact of functionality, we leave it turned off. In the case of skin softening, I'd suggest the opposite is probably the right approach for most people. If you are shooting raw, then if you have it turned off because it doesn't impact you through your perhaps Adobe workflow or some other third-party package, then if you ever want to go back and open up NX Studio and use it, you can't, because if you've turned it off, then you can't go back and turn it on in post-production as of today. So having it turned on doesn't affect your workflow, but it allows you other opportunities. If, however, you're shooting JPEG, then the impact is quite noticeable, and therefore have a think about what's the nature of your subject, what's the context you're shooting within, and therefore what's the right balance of skin softening and picture controls, because ultimately it will get you probably a better outcome, and also it will save you time in post-processing. If we think about video, then it's similar. If you're going to be shooting raw video, then it's not applicable, and you're probably going to be doing color grading independently anyway. But if you're shooting with a codec like H.265, then I think it's worth actually using skin softening, because it reduces the amount of post-processing you have to do. So it'd be great to hear how you're using skin softening. What are your thoughts on it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. It'd be great to hear from you. And as always, it'd be great to see you in a future video.